Alright, what's up, biology students? It's Mr. Holloway here with another video lecture about human anatomy and physiology. The topic of today's video is going to be the skeletal system, the muscular system, and the integumentary system. Three of our body systems that have a lot to do with movement, support, and protecting our internal organs. Now, we all know that the skeletal system is there in part to provide our bodies with support. And without our skeleton, we would be just a pile of soft tissue that wouldn't be able to move. But our skeletal system does a lot more than just support us and allow us to stand upright. It's also a place for our bodies to store minerals like calcium and phosphorus, and a place for our bodies to store lipids in the form of yellow marrow. And all of that stuff can then be accessed by our body as needed and actually taken out of our bones if other parts of our body should need it. Our skeletal system is also the site of blood cell production, which takes place in the red marrow of our bones. Our skeletal system also provides protection for our internal organs and leverage for the muscular system to pull against in order to produce movement. Now, bones come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes, as we can see in this picture in the lower right corner of our screen. And those different shapes and sizes allow those different kinds of bones to do a lot of different things in our body. And bones are interacting with other bones, and bones are interacting with muscles in order to produce movement, provide protection, and do all of that great stuff we talked about on the last slide. And bones are held together with a lot of different kinds of connective tissue. In fact, bones themselves are made up of connective tissue. But some particular kinds of connective tissue that we need to know about in terms of how the skeleton is held together are these things called ligaments. And a ligament is something that attaches one bone to another bone. These things called tendons, and tendons are things that attach a bone to a muscle. And this stuff called cartilage, which pads our bones and provides cushioning in a joint where two bones normally rub up against one another, and that prevents those bones from doing any damage to one another inside of a joint. And there are a lot of different kinds of joints, or a lot of different ways that two bones or more bones than just two can come together and allow for movement. We've got pivot joints like the ones in our neck that allows our head to swivel back and forth. We've got these ball and socket joints like the one in our shoulder that allows our upper arm to move around in almost 360 degrees. We've got these hinge joints like the ones in our elbows and in our knees. We've got these saddle joints like the ones in our thumb that allow our thumb to move both back and forth and up and down. We've got these gliding joints like all the ones in our hand that allow our hand to move around and our wrist to move all around. And we've got these condyloid joints like the ones in our fingers that allow for articulation and ultimately allow us to grab things. Now, this is a pretty typical bone. This is a bone like the femur in your upper leg or like the humerus in your upper arm. And specifically, this is called a long bone. And we're going to learn some terms to describe the different parts of this bone. The ends of a long bone are called the epiphyses, or singular epiphysis. So each long bone has an epiphysis at one end and an epiphysis at the other end. And in the middle, the long shaft is called the diaphysis. And our bone is made up of both compact bone, which is really tightly packed bone tissue, and it's also made of spongy bone, which is a lot less dense. It's got these spaces, and in those spaces is where we find red marrow, which is where new blood cells are being produced. Yellow marrow, on the other hand, which is where lipids are stored inside of our bones, is stored within the compact bone in this special cavity in the center of the diaphysis. Then all of that stuff is wrapped together in this smooth coating that goes around the outside of our bone called the periosteum, and each end of the bone has a cartilage pad to cushion that bone in a joint where it might encounter other bones. Now, because bone is living tissue, our bones also have a blood supply, and that blood supply brings in nutrients, removes waste, and helps gather up the new blood cells that are being produced in our red marrow. And if you're young enough to still be growing and getting taller, you have this area in your long bones called a growth plate, which is where your bone is actually still growing and getting longer. And as you age and as you stop growing, that growth plate is going to go away and be replaced by a spongy bone, as in the rest of the bone tissue in that part of the epiphysis. Now, all of the different kinds of bones in our body are organized into this structure called the skeleton. And the skeleton can be broken down into two parts. There's the axial skeleton, which is pretty much all the stuff in the middle of our skeletal system, our head, our neck, our rib cage, and our vertebral column. And there is the appendicular skeleton, which is all the stuff off to the sides, our arms and legs, our hands and feet, and that kind of stuff. And all of these bones allow for movement and protection, as in the case of the rib cage. And we've got another example over here with the spinal column, or the vertebral column. And all of these different vertebrae, which come in a bunch of different sizes, are all protecting this really important organ down there in the center of the vertebral column called the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is the main piece of nervous tissue that connects our brain to all the stuff below our neck. So it's really important that this structure be protected, and the vertebral column does that while also allowing our spine to move back and forth and to bend and to flex in a lot of different directions. It's pretty remarkable, actually, how much movement our spine is capable of because of all of these discs of different sizes stacked on top of one another and with a piece of cartilage in between each to cushion them and allow for flexibility. And if we zoom in on our bone is really a pretty remarkable structure. It is both strong, flexible, and lightweight. And this stuff called calcium phosphate, which is a mineral, is what provides the hard part, or the rigid part of our bones. But it's also mixed up with this stuff called collagen, and collagen is a flexible protein that provides flexibility, so that our bones are both strong and able to bend a little bit before they break. Which is what allows athletes to do all kinds of amazing things without actually breaking their bones, as a lot of other material would do when put under the kind of stress that high-performance athletes put their bones under. And our bones are also filled with these hollow spaces that provide lightness, so our bones are strong, flexible, and lightweight. It's a pretty remarkable substance, all things considered. And if we zoom in on the compact part of our bones, the really rigid, really strong parts of our bones, we can see this system of cylinders called the Haversian system. And each one of these cylinders is called osteon, and all of these osteons packaged together are what we call the Haversian system, and that makes up our compact bone. And in the center of each one of these osteons is a canal called the Haversian canal. And that canal allows nerve tissue and blood vessels to come in and infiltrate our bones, allowing for signaling and the removal of waste and the delivery of nutrients and all of that kind of stuff. And the cylinder is a very strong shape. If you've ever stood on top of an aluminum can, you'll know that if you stand on it in just the right way, an aluminum can support the weight of a full-grown human, even though it's just a very thin amount of aluminum metal. That has to do with the shape. The cylinder is a very strong shape. And you can imagine that if you had one pencil, which is pretty much a cylinder, one pencil is pretty easy to break. But when you have 10 or 20 pencils all packaged together in an even bigger cylinder, that becomes pretty difficult to break. And that's essentially how these osteons are packaged together in the Haversian system of our bones, like a whole bunch of pencils wrapped together in an outer coating that we call the periosteum. And bone is a living tissue, which means that bone is able to replenish itself, as anybody who has ever broken a bone will be able to test to. And our bone is made up of cells, as well as this hard calcium phosphate matrix in which those cells are embedded. And there are three particular kinds of bone cells that are worth knowing about. There are osteoblasts, and osteoblasts are like the builders. They're the cells that are depositing new calcium phosphate and laying down new bone. Then there are osteoclasts, and osteoclasts are the recyclers. They dissolve away the old calcium phosphate to make room for the osteoblast to come in and put down new calcium phosphate to rebuild that bone. And then there are the osteocytes, and the osteocytes are actually embedded in the calcium phosphate and collagen matrix, and they're like the maintainers. They maintain that bone tissue until it needs to be replaced by adding new calcium phosphate and things like that. And over time, it's important for us to make sure that we're taking in enough raw materials to keep our skeleton healthy, because if we don't, we run the risk of developing something that's called osteoporosis, which basically means porous bone. And it should be pretty obvious from this picture why it's called that. So when your osteoclasts are breaking down old bone faster than your osteoblasts can build new bone, the result is what we see here in this picture, where your bones have increasing space inside of them and a decreasing amount of calcium phosphate, and they become brittle and weak over time. So it's important to make sure that you're taking in enough calcium to make sure that our bones can replenish themselves so that our osteoblasts can continue to build new bone and keep our bones healthy over time and prevent this kind of thing from happening as we grow older. Now, like all the systems in the body, the muscular system has a lot of different important functions, not the least of which is to produce skeletal movement. But the muscular system also helps to maintain posture and body position, helps to support soft tissue, it guards the openings and exits to the body, maintains body temperature, and aids in blood circulation and in digestion. If you think about that term that we learned, peristalsis, peristalsis is those muscle contractions that occur in the digestive system that keep moving in the right direction through our esophagus and through our stomach and through our small and large intestines. And thinking ahead to what you might already know about the circulatory system, well, the heart is basically one giant muscle that's specialized to be able to contract over and over and over again to be able to pump all that blood around our body. Now, there are 3 different kinds of muscle cells that make up 3 different kinds of muscle tissues, and each one of those muscle tissues is specialized for a particular function within the body. And we just talked about the heart, and the heart is made up of one of these kinds of muscle tissues called cardiac muscle tissue, which is made up of cardiac muscle cells. And these cells are found only in the heart, and they are specialized for the functions performed by the heart, namely to contract over and over and over and over and over again, approximately 60 times every minute for our entire life. And so these kinds of muscle cells are only found in the heart because that's the only muscle that has to do that kind of job. We also have skeletal muscle tissues, and skeletal muscle tissues are under our conscious control, meaning that when we think about them, they act. Cardiac muscle just acts all by itself. It's under unconscious control, which is good because then we don't have to think about making our heart beat. Our body just takes care of that function for us. But skeletal muscle is under our control, and it is anchored to the skeletal frame by way of this connective tissue called tendons. So all of this skeletal muscle tissue is connected to a tendon, and that tendon anchors that muscle to a bone so that that muscle can pull against the bone in order to produce movement on command. And then we've also got this stuff called smooth muscle tissue. And smooth muscle tissue, kind of like cardiac muscle tissue, is under unconscious control, meaning we don't have to think about it in order for it to work. But smooth muscle tissue isn't found in the heart because it's not specialized for that sort of repeated contraction over and over and over and over again all the time. However, we do find smooth muscle tissue lining our digestive tract. Peristalsis is the result of contractions in smooth muscle tissue that lines our esophagus and our stomach and our lower intestines and stuff like that. And if we zoom in on a muscle and take a look at an individual muscle cell, which we call a muscle fiber because of its long fibrous appearance, we can see some really important structures in this muscle cell. First of all, there's the nucleus, which tells you that this is in fact just a single cell. But then within this single cell that we call a muscle fiber, we find all of these sort of microfibers that we call myofibrils. And all of those myofibrils are bundled together in one muscle cell or one muscle fiber. And then if we zoom in even further on a myofibril, we find that that myofibril contains its own microfilaments. And these filaments are made of two really important proteins called actin and myosin. And these really important protein filaments are ultimately what are responsible for muscle contractions. So when we say that we need to consume a lot of protein in order to build our muscles, this is why. Our muscles contain very important structures made of protein that allow our muscles to do their job. Alright, so let's zoom in on one of these myofibrils, keeping in mind that a single muscle cell is made up of dozens or even hundreds of these myofibrils all bundled together, and that a muscle like your bicep is made of hundreds of muscle cells, each with hundreds of myofibrils all bundled together. So there's a lot of repeating structures here that make our cells capable of generating movement. And in this diagram here, we see that functional unit of muscle, that thing called the sarcomere. And a sarcomere is basically the place where these actin filaments, which we see here highlighted in yellow, and where these myosin filaments that we see highlighted here in red, a sarcomere is the place where these two protein filaments overlap. And because they overlap, they're able to basically grab onto one another and sort of pull past one another in order to generate a muscle contraction. And if we watch this animation, we should see how that works. And while you watch this animation, you should notice that the overall length of the actin and myosin filaments doesn't actually change. But because they're pulling past one another, the length of the sarcomere overall does get shorter, and that's what we call a muscle contraction. Now this process requires a lot of ATP. Every time one of those little foot-shaped structures on the myosin fiber reaches up and grabs the actin and pulls on it, that's an action that requires energy, and the energy for that is provided by a molecule that we're already a little bit familiar with called ATP, which is why our muscle cells have so many mitochondria in them. Because mitochondria are breaking down glucose and releasing that energy and packaging it into ATP molecules, our muscle cells need a ton of mitochondria inside of them to provide all of that ATP for all of those muscle contractions. And this whole idea, the idea that we have protein filaments called myosin and actin, and those protein filaments are pulling past one another in order to shorten this unit that we call the sarcomere, that whole thing is an idea that we call the sliding filament model, and it explains how a muscle contraction occurs. And we can see in this picture that when a muscle is relaxed, those actin and myosin fibers, they don't really overlap very much. But then as the muscle contracts, they overlap a great deal, and the distance between those structures that we call the Z-discs gets shorter. And this whole thing down here on the bottom, or on the top, wherever you want to look at it, that is a sarcomere, and that's the unit of a muscle cell that gets shorter during a muscle contraction in order to produce movement. Now the integumentary system actually contains the biggest organ in our body, the skin. And you may not think of the skin as being a particularly important organ, at least not as important as like the heart, for example, but all of our organs are really, really important, and the skin is just as important as any other organ in our body in protecting us and helping us to maintain homeostasis. So the integumentary system, whose main organ is the skin, helps provide protection from things like pathogens, bacteria and viruses, protection from desiccation or drying out, and protection from UV radiation. The integumentary system also helps our body to regulate its internal temperature and is involved with excretion of metabolic waste, as we learned about in our last video about the excretory system. The integumentary system is also responsible for information gathering. It puts us in contact with our external environment so that we can receive stimulus from our external environment and so that our body can respond to changes in our environment. And the integumentary system also helps our body with vitamin D production. And vitamin D production is really important because it's necessary for healthy bone growth. In fact, when you go outside and you're standing in the sun, that actually helps your integumentary system to process more vitamin D. And vitamin D helps our small intestine to absorb more calcium and phosphate, so that when we've got enough vitamin D, we can be sure that we're getting plenty of calcium and phosphorus from the food that we eat so that we can ensure healthy bone growth. Without enough exposure to the sun, we don't get enough vitamin D, and without enough vitamin D, we don't absorb enough calcium and phosphorus, and our bones get kind of weak and brittle over time. Now, like I said, the main organ of the integumentary system is the skin, but the integumentary system also includes our hair and nails. If we take a closer look at our skin, however, we can see that our skin is made up of three distinct layers, those being the epidermis, or the outer layer, the dermis, or the middle layer, and the hypodermis, or the undermost layer. Now, the hypodermis is mostly made up of fat and connective tissue, and is basically there for support and insulation and things like that, helping to keep the heat in and keep our bodies warm and things like that, while also providing cushioning. The epidermis, at least the very top layer of the epidermis, is made up of dead cells, and right under that layer of dead cells is a layer of rapidly growing and regenerating cells. And that's why we sort of shed our skin cells so rapidly, is because the ones on the outermost surfaces are dead cells, and eventually they wear out and brush away. But new cells are constantly being produced underneath in the epidermis to replace those dead cells and ultimately keep our skin healthy. And in the dermis, which is the center layer, that's where we find a lot of nerve endings, capillaries, hair follicles, which is where our hair grows from, and all of that stuff is contained in the middle layer that we call the dermis. And our skin responds to changes in temperature, as you are probably aware if you've ever gotten goosebumps. But what's also happening is that when we're exposed to colder temperatures than our body would like, a lot of those capillaries in the dermis, they sort of tighten up and recede back into our skin, sort of getting closer to the center of our body and preventing heat loss to our external environment. And then on warm days, those capillaries expand and they get a lot closer to the surface of our skin, which is why our skin kind of looks red when it's hot outside. Not necessarily because of a sunburn, but because our blood vessels are closer to the surface. And if we get too cold, we kind of look a little blue because our blood vessels get farther away from the surface. But that's all meant to help us maintain our internal temperature, and it's an example of how our integumentary system helps us respond to changes in our environment, and also helps us to maintain homeostasis in the process. Keratin is a tough, fibrous protein, another example of how proteins are important, and it's found primarily in the hair and nails, and it's produced in the epidermis. And this tough protein sort of resists wearing out, and is why our nails are hard and why our hair is coarse and things like that. So keratin is another really important protein produced by our bodies that is involved, in this case, with the integumentary system. Our skin also produces a pigment called melanin, and depending on how much melanin you have produced in your skin is either going to be darker or lighter. If you have a lot of melanin production, your skin is going to be darker. Not very much melanin production means kind of lighter skin. And things like moles, kind of dark patches on your skin, those are particularly dense patches of that particular pigment. And this pigment is kind of meant to protect us from the sun's radiation. And this pigment absorbs UV radiation, ultimately to protect our internal structures from being exposed to that ultraviolet radiation. And melanin is produced in these cells in the epidermis called melanocytes. And hopefully you can see a relationship between those two words. Now we also find these things called sebaceous glands inside of our integumentary system. And sebaceous glands excrete a substance known as sebum, and sebum is a slightly acidic, oily substance secreted by these glands, and these glands are found in the dermis. And sebum helps to keep our skin waterproof, and it actually helps to kill bacteria on the surface of our skin as well. Now, our skin does protect us from the sun's radiation, but it's important not to overexpose ourselves to the sun, because overexposure to the sun's radiation can cause a cancer of the integumentary system that we know more familiarly as skin cancer. And there are two different kinds of skin cancer. There's these things called carcinomas, and there's these things called melanomas. Now, carcinomas, as we can see in this description, come in two types. There are basal cell carcinomas and squamous cell carcinomas. Now, the thing about these types of skin cancers, fortunately for us, is that they don't really spread. Treatment is important so that they don't damage the integumentary system too much, but the chances of them spreading to other areas of the body is basically non-existent. However, melanomas are a big concern in that regard. Melanomas are much more likely to spread to other systems of the body through metastasis, thereby spreading that cancer to another system of the body where it can grow and put down roots in a new part of our internal environment. And melanomas are cancers that develop from melanocytes, which is where they get their name from. So it's important to keep an eye on your moles. And if you notice a mole that's getting bigger or is getting darker or has a particularly weird shape about it, it never hurts to have it checked out by a doctor. If it does turn out to be a melanoma, and most moles aren't, most moles are totally harmless, but if it does turn out to be a melanoma, you're going to be glad that a doctor found it early, because then they can remove it early, and the chances of that cancer spreading to a different part of your body are going to be very, very small. So keep an eye on those moles and keep yourself healthy. Now, looking back at how these systems work together to help us maintain homeostasis, remember, homeostasis is about maintaining balance in our internal environment. The skeletal system helps us to maintain that balance by storing and releasing minerals as needed. Calcium and phosphorus are stored in our bones and then can be released from our bones when our body needs them. Our skeletal system also helps produce blood cells that transport oxygen and help fight disease. And our skeletal system helps protect our organs from damage. And if it can prevent them from getting damaged, those organs can help us to further maintain homeostasis. Our muscular system helps guard the opening and exits of our body, preventing foreign invaders and pathogens and things like that from getting in and causing an infection. Our muscular system also helps us to maintain body temperature, because all of those muscle contractions are producing a lot of heat. As our body uses that ATP to contract our muscles, a lot of that energy is being released into our body as heat, and a lot of that heat helps us to maintain our internal body temperature. And the muscular system also helps us to circulate our blood and to move food through the digestive tract so that we can get the needed materials to help us stay healthy and rebuild our structures and stay energetic and all of that kind of stuff. And the integumentary system helps us to maintain homeostasis by protecting us against pathogens, toxins, and radiations that might get absorbed into our system from the external environment. It helps us to maintain our body temperature, and I gave you some examples of how our integumentary system responds to changes in the external temperature to keep our internal temperature pretty stable. And it helps inform us about our environmental conditions. It also assists in vitamin D production, and vitamin D production is important for healthy bone growth, so that as our body is removing calcium and phosphorus from our bones to use it in other parts of the body, our integumentary system is helping our body to replace that calcium and phosphorus. So all three of these systems play key roles in helping our body to maintain an internal equilibrium that we call homeostasis. Hopefully you learned a lot. Don't be afraid to go back and watch this video as many times as you need to make sure that you learn the concepts. And we'll talk about some more of this stuff when I see you next time in class.